I still remember the exact moment my world shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't during a screaming match or after discovering some terrible secret. It was while I lay helpless in a sterile hospital bed in Riverside General, tubes snaking from my arms, when a delivery man walked in with an envelope that would change everything. What my husband Marcus couldn't have possibly known was that the signature at the bottom of my lawyer's business card would soon turn his calculated betrayal into the biggest mistake of his life. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. The fluorescent. Lights above my bed hummed their monotonous tune as I stared at the manila envelope in my trembling hands. 3 weeks I'd been here in Portland's most prestigious medical facility, fighting for my life after what doctors initially thought was a routine gallbladder surgery turned into a nightmare of complications and infections. 3 weeks of Marcus promising me everything would be okay, that he'd handle everything at home, that I should just focus on getting better. The irony was almost laughable now. There I was, literally fighting to stay alive, while the man who'd sworn to love me in sickness and in health was apparently filing paperwork to abandon ship at my most vulnerable moment. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with 7 years of marriage that were about to be legally dissolved by a man who couldn't even be bothered to tell me to my face. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want you to know that what you're about to hear isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when someone underestimates the wrong person at exactly the wrong time. If this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something even more shocking saved for you. Now, let me tell you how Marcus Thompson learned that some battles you simply can't win. I'd been admitted to Riverside General after collapsing during what should have been a routine day at my consulting firm, Meridian Strategies, in downtown Portland. The pain had been building for weeks, but like the dedicated workaholic I'd always been, I'd pushed through it, attributing it to stress from our latest client acquisition. Marcus had been supportive then, driving me to the emergency room himself, holding my hand as they wheeled me into surgery. What I didn't know was that while I was unconscious on that operating table, fighting infections that would keep me hospitalized for weeks, Marcus was already consulting with his attorney about the fastest way to dissolve our marriage and protect his assets. The man I'd trusted with my business decisions, my financial planning, and my heart had apparently seen my medical crisis not as a challenge we'd face together, but as an opportunity to escape what he'd decided was an inconvenient marriage. The delivery guy couldn't have been older than 22, probably a college student making extra money, shifted uncomfortably as he watched me sign for the envelope. He knew what he was delivering. You could see it in his eyes. That mixture of pity and discomfort that comes from being the messenger in someone else's worst day. "I'm really sorry, ma'am," he mumbled before practically fleeing from my room, leaving me alone with what felt like a ticking bomb in my hands. I didn't open it immediately. Something in my gut already knew what those papers contained, and I wasn't ready to make it real yet. Instead, I stared out the window at the Columbia River flowing endlessly toward the ocean, wondering how many other people were having their lives dismantled while they watched that same water flow by. The nurses had been commenting on my remarkable recovery lately, how my vital signs had stabilized, how the infections were finally clearing up. Apparently, my body was healing just in time for my heart to be systematically destroyed. When I finally broke the seal and pulled out those documents, the words "petition for dissolution of marriage" seemed to float off the page like some kind of cruel joke. Marcus had been thorough, I'll give him that. Every asset, every investment, every piece of property we'd accumulated during our 7 years together was listed with the cold precision of someone who'd clearly been planning this for far longer than my 3-week hospital stay. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just the divorce petition itself, it was how he'd structured it. Our house in the prestigious Hawthorne district, the one I'd saved for and negotiated the purchase of before we even got married, He wanted to force a sale and split the proceeds. My consulting business, the company I'd built from nothing into a seven-figure enterprise while he focused on his real estate career, he was claiming partial ownership based on strategic guidance and financial support. Even my grandmother's antique jewelry collection, pieces that had been in my family for generations, were listed as marital assets subject to equitable distribution. The audacity was breathtaking. Here I was, literally fighting for my life in a hospital bed, and Marcus had calculated that this was the perfect time to dismantle everything I'd worked for and claim it as his own. He'd even included a sticky note from his lawyer, Connor Walsh from Walsh & Associates, requesting an expedited response due to the client's desire for a swift resolution. Swift resolution. As if 7 years of marriage were nothing more than a business transaction that had run its course. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known as he sat in Connor Walsh's office planning my financial destruction, was that the name at the bottom of my attorney's business card would soon make him wake up in cold sweats. Because while he'd been calculating how to maximize his takeaway from our marriage, I'd been quietly building something he'd never even noticed. The monitor next to my bed started beeping faster as my heart rate spiked. But for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from pain or infection. It was from something much more powerful, the crystal-clear realization that my loving husband had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his entire life. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. To understand how Marcus Thompson made such a catastrophic error in judgment, you need to know who we were before that envelope arrived. Or, rather, who he thought we were versus who we actually were. 7 years of marriage had created a comfortable illusion that I was the supportive wife who'd stepped back from her ambitions to help build his real estate empire, when the truth was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous to his carefully laid plans. I met Marcus at a networking event in downtown Portland back in 2016. I was 28, fresh off launching Meridian Strategies after leaving my corporate consulting job at McKinsey & Company. He was 31, charming, ambitious, and working his way up at Cascade Realty Group, one of Portland's most prestigious firms. What attracted me wasn't just his confidence, though he had that in spades. It was how he seemed genuinely impressed by my business acumen and entrepreneurial drive. Those early months were intoxicating. Marcus would brag to his friends about his brilliant girlfriend who's building her own consulting empire. He'd bring clients to the upscale restaurants where we'd have dinner, casually mentioning my strategic work with Fortune 500 companies. I was his trophy in the best possible way, not because of how I looked, but because of what I'd accomplished. It felt like the perfect partnership of two ambitious professionals building something together. The proposal came 18 months later, right on schedule according to Marcus's carefully planned life timeline. He'd taken me to Multnomah Falls, that iconic Oregon waterfall where countless Portland couples had gotten engaged before us. The ring was flawless, a 2-carat solitaire that he'd selected with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to his real estate deals. "I want to build an empire with you, Isabella," he'd said, using my full name the way he did when he was being serious. "Your business mind and my market knowledge will be unstoppable." I should have paid more attention to the phrase "build an empire with you," because Marcus had very specific ideas about what role each of us would play in that empire. The shift was subtle at first, so gradual that I didn't recognize it as manipulation until it was far too late. It started with innocent suggestions about optimizing our tax situation by restructuring some of my business finances. Then came the gentle pressure to add his name to various accounts for simplification purposes. Marcus was brilliant at making control feel like collaboration. When I landed my biggest client in 2019, a tech startup that needed strategic guidance for their IPO, he suggested celebrating by buying our dream house in the Hawthorne district. The Victorian mansion had been my fantasy home since I'd first moved to Portland, and when it came on the market, Marcus negotiated the purchase with his typical precision. What I didn't realize until years later was how he'd structured the financing. To maximize his legal claim on a property I'd essentially paid for with my business profits. "You focus on growing Meridian's strategies," he'd say whenever I questioned certain financial decisions. "Let me handle the investment portfolio and property management. That's what I'm good at." It seemed logical, two professionals leveraging their individual expertise for mutual benefit. I was so busy building my client base and managing complex strategic projects that I was grateful to have someone I trusted handling our personal finances. The business grew exponentially under my leadership. Meridian Strategies went from a one-woman operation to a 15-person firm with satellite offices in Seattle and San Francisco. We were pulling in 7 figures annually, working with everyone from emerging startups to established corporations needing strategic pivots. Marcus loved attending my company events, networking with my clients, positioning himself as the power behind the throne who provided the stability that allowed me to take risks. But somewhere around year 4 of our marriage, I started noticing subtle changes in how Marcus talked about our business. He'd casually mention strategic advice he'd given me, inflating his role in decisions he'd barely been involved in. At dinner parties, he'd tell stories about pivotal conversations we'd had about client strategies, conversations I couldn't remember because they'd never happened. When friends or colleagues complimented Meridian's success, Marcus would smile and say things like, "Isabella's the face of it, but we're really a team behind the scenes." The most insidious part was how he made me complicit in this revisionist history. He'd reference these fictional contributions in front of clients or at industry events, and correcting him publicly would have been awkward and potentially damaging to both our reputations. So I'd smile and nod, letting him claim credit for insights and strategies that were entirely my own. I told myself it was harmless. Couples often inflated each other's contributions out of love and support. What I didn't understand was that Marcus was building a legal and social foundation for claiming ownership of my work. Every public acknowledgement of his strategic contributions, every financial document that showed joint assets, every photograph of us together at Meridian-related events was becoming evidence in a case I didn't know was being built against me. The warning signs were there, scattered throughout our last 2 years together like breadcrumbs I was too busy to follow. Marcus's increasing interest in my client contracts and revenue projections. His suggestions about protecting our assets through various legal structures. His insistence on attending meetings with my accountant and lawyer. The way he'd casually mention how much we'd built together whenever Meridian's valuation came up. But I was completely, utterly blind to what was coming. I thought Marcus was proud of our success. I believed his interest in my business came from love and partnership. I trusted him with everything, my finances, my legal decisions, my vulnerable moments when clients were difficult or business challenges seemed overwhelming. That trust was about to become the weapon he used to try, to destroy everything I'd built. I needed another week in the hospital after the divorce papers arrived. Not because of my medical condition, that was actually improving rapidly, but because the stress of Marcus's betrayal triggered a setback that had my doctors genuinely concerned. My blood pressure spiked, my heart rate became erratic, and the ET infections that had been retreating suddenly flared up again. It was as if my body was refusing to heal while my mind processed the magnitude of what my husband had done. During those additional 7 days, I had nothing but time to piece together the full scope of Marcus's deception. And what I discovered, lying in that sterile room with nothing but my laptop and a growing sense of dread, was that the divorce papers were just the tip of an iceberg that went much deeper than I'd ever imagined. It started with something small, a discrepancy in our joint savings account that I noticed while reviewing financial statements my assistant had brought from the office. There should have been $847,000 in our primary account, money we'd been saving for a potential real estate investment. Instead, there was $127,000. When I called the bank, They informed me that Marcus had made several large transfers over the past 4 months, moving funds to accounts I'd never heard of. That's when I started digging deeper, and what I found made my stomach turn. Our investment portfolio, which should have contained nearly $2.3 million in diversified holdings, had been systematically liquidated over the past 18 months. Marcus had been selling off stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, always in amounts, just small enough to avoid triggering alerts that would have required my signature. He'd forged my initials on dozens of documents, creating a paper trail that showed my apparent consent to these transactions. But the financial betrayal was just the beginning. As I delved deeper into our shared accounts and documents, I discovered that Marcus hadn't just been stealing our money, he'd been actively undermining my business for over a year. Using passwords he'd somehow obtained, he'd been accessing my client communications, copying proprietary methodologies I'd developed, and downloading strategic plans that represented years of my intellectual work. The most damning evidence came from his computer, which I was able to access remotely because we'd shared certain cloud accounts for household management. In a folder labeled Business Development, I found dozens of files containing my confidential client strategies, market analyses, and innovative approaches that had made Meridian Strategies so successful. But these weren't just copies. Marcus had been systematically rebranding my work under a new company name, Thompson Strategic Solutions. He'd been planning to launch a competing firm using my own methodologies against me. The business registration documents showed he'd filed the paperwork 3 months ago, right around the time he'd started pressuring me to take on more clients and expand Meridian's operations. He'd been encouraging me to overextend myself and my team, knowing that if I was stretched too thin, his new company could swoop in and steal clients with strategies I'd developed. The betrayal went even deeper than corporate espionage. Marcus had been conducting what could only be described as a campaign of strategic sabotage against my reputation in Portland's business community. I found email threads where he'd been subtly undermining my credibility with industry contacts, suggesting that my recent success was due to market timing rather than skill, and that Meridian Strategies was overvalued and due for a correction. He'd been having lunch meetings with my competitors, ostensibly as social networking, but actually to share intelligence about my client base and upcoming projects. One particularly devastating email chain showed him discussing my upcoming medical issues with Gerald Hoffman, the CEO of Cascade Strategic Group, my biggest competitor. This conversation had taken place 2 weeks before I was even hospitalized, which meant Marcus had been planning to use my health crisis as a business opportunity long before it actually happened. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline Marcus had created, mapping out what he called his transition strategy. The document outlined how he planned to file for divorce during my hospitalization, when I'd be least capable of mounting effective resistance. It included strategies for claiming partial ownership of Meridian Strategies, forcing the sale of our home, and liquidating assets before I could recover enough to protect them. The timeline even included contingency plans for different scenarios. If I recovered quickly, he'd claim the divorce was mutual and amicable, positioning himself as the supportive ex-husband who was helping me through a difficult transition. If my recovery took longer, he'd argue that my medical condition made me unfit to run a consulting business, justifying his claims to ownership and control. Marcus had literally planned to weaponize my illness against me, timing his betrayal for maximum financial advantage while ensuring I'd be too physically and emotionally compromised to fight back effectively. The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by relationship problems, but a methodical demolition of everything I'd worked for, timed to coincide with my greatest vulnerability. The email that broke me was one he'd sent to his brother Jake just 3 days after I'd been admitted to the hospital. "Isabella's medical situation is actually perfect timing," he'd written. "She'll be dealing with recovery for months, which gives me a clear runway to establish Thompson Strategic, and lock in the divorce terms before she's mentally sharp enough to see what's happening. By the time she's back on her feet, it'll be too late to do anything about it. As I read those words, lying in a hospital bed with IV tubes still attached to my arms, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who'd trusted Marcus with everything, who'd believed in our partnership and shared dreams, died in that moment. What emerged in her place was someone Marcus had never met and couldn't have prepared for. Someone who'd been systematically underestimated and was about to become very, very dangerous. Because what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have discovered despite all his spying and planning, was that Isabella Chen wasn't just a successful consultant with a growing firm. I was also the daughter of David Chen, one of the most feared litigation attorneys on the West Coast, and the goddaughter of federal judge Patricia Yamamoto. Marcus thought he was divorcing a vulnerable woman with a small business. He was about to discover he'd declared war on a family that had been winning legal battles since before he was born. The moment of clarity came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 8 days after Marcus had served me those divorce papers. I'd been lying awake for hours, my mind racing through everything I'd discovered about his systematic betrayal, when something shifted inside me like a gear clicking into place. The victim who'd been crying into hospital pillows for over a week suddenly vanished, replaced by someone Marcus had never encountered during our 7 years together, the strategic mastermind who'd built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from nothing. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized but never called. It rang twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered, despite the ungodly hour. "Isabella? What's wrong, sweetheart?" My father's voice carried that immediate alertness that comes from decades of handling legal emergencies. David Chen didn't sleep soundly when family was in crisis. "Dad, I need you to come to Portland. Tonight, if possible. And I need you to bring the file." There was a pause. My father knew exactly which file I meant. The one he'd been maintaining. For the past 3 years, ever since he'd quietly run a background check on Marcus after our engagement. Dad had never liked my husband, though he'd been diplomatically silent about his concerns. As one of California's most successful litigation attorneys, David Chen had developed an instinct for reading people that rarely failed him. "I'll be on the first flight out of San Francisco," he said without hesitation. "Do you need me to call Patricia?" Patricia, my godmother, federal judge Patricia Yamamoto, who'd been like a second mother to me since my own mother's death when I was 12. "Not yet, but maybe soon," I replied, feeling the first stirrings of what would become Marcus's worst nightmare. By 6 a.m., I was making a series of phone calls that would set everything in motion. First, I called my assistant Jennifer and asked her to quietly secure all digital files related to Meridian Strategies, changing passwords and creating backup systems that Marcus couldn't access. Then I contacted my business attorney, Susan Rodriguez, and scheduled an emergency meeting for later that week. But the most important call was to someone Marcus had never heard of, despite 7 years of marriage. My college roommate at Stanford, Lisa Park, who'd gone on to become one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. Lisa specialized in high-net-worth divorces where one spouse had been hiding assets or engaging in financial deception. Her reputation was so fearsome that opposing counsel often settled rather than face her in court. "Isabella Chen." Lisa's voice carried genuine warmth mixed with professional interest when she heard my situation. "I've been wondering when you'd call. I've been watching your husband's financial activities for the past 6 months." The statement stopped me cold. "What do you mean, watching his activities?" "Your father asked me to keep an eye on things after Marcus started making some interesting moves in the real estate market. Did you know he's been buying properties under shell companies and listing them as business investments rather than marital assets? We've been documenting everything." Chopped. Revelation that my father had been quietly investigating Marcus for months should have surprised me. But instead, it felt like validation. Dad's instincts about people were legendary in legal circles, and if he'd sensed something wrong with Marcus, he'd been right to act on those instincts. Lisa continued, "We have evidence of at least 14 separate financial irregularities, including some transactions that might constitute fraud. Your husband has been very busy, but also very sloppy. It's almost like he didn't think anyone was watching." That afternoon, while Marcus was presumably at his office planning his new business venture with my stolen intellectual property, I was making decisions that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our divorce proceedings. Instead of the vulnerable, overwhelmed wife he expected to manipulate, Marcus was about to encounter a coordinated legal response that would make his divorce attorney earn every penny of his considerable fees. The first step was information security. Using techniques I'd learned during my McKinsey days working with companies facing hostile takeovers, I began systematically documenting Marcus's access to my business systems and cutting off his ability to cause further damage. Jennifer worked with our IT consultant to create forensic copies of all systems, preserving evidence of Marcus's unauthorized access while preventing future breaches. Meanwhile, I reached out to my network of business contacts, not for emotional support, but for strategic intelligence gathering. Portland's professional community was surprisingly small and interconnected, and I needed to understand exactly what Marcus had been telling people about our marriage and my business capabilities. The conversations were illuminating and infuriating, in equal measure. Margaret Williams, who ran the city's most exclusive networking group for entrepreneurs, revealed that Marcus had been subtly spreading rumors about my mental health and business judgment for months. "He kept mentioning how stressed you'd been, how the business was taking a toll on your well-being," she told me during a carefully casual phone conversation. "He made it sound like he was concerned about your ability to handle the pressure." This wasn't random gossip. It was strategic reputation management designed to undermine my credibility before the divorce became public. Marcus had been laying groundwork to portray me as an unstable business owner whose success was largely due to his behind-the-scenes support and guidance. But Marcus had made a crucial error in his campaign of subtle character assassination. He'd underestimated how respected I was in Portland's business community and how many people had witnessed my capabilities firsthand. When I began making discreet inquiries, I discovered that most of his attempts at reputation damage had actually backfired, making him appear petty and unreliable rather than achieving his intended effect. The defining moment of my transformation, from victim to strategic opponent, came when my father arrived at Riverside General that evening, carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression I remembered from my childhood when he was preparing for trial. David Chen was 62 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of a quiet intensity that had made him one of California's most feared litigators. "Tell me everything," he said simply, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair beside my bed. For the next 3 hours, I laid out the full scope of Marcus's betrayal, the financial theft, the business espionage, the strategic timeline for using my hospitalization against me. Dad listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in the legal pad he'd brought, his expression growing darker as the scope of Marcus's deception became clear. When I finished, he opened the folder he'd brought and spread several documents across my hospital table. "I've been investigating your husband since 2021, he said matter-of-factly. "Something about him never sat right with me, so I had Lisa run a comprehensive background check. What we found was interesting enough that I've been monitoring his activities ever since." The documents told a story that made my recent discoveries look amateur by comparison. Marcus had been engaged twice before our relationship, and both previous engagements had ended under suspicious financial circumstances. His first fiancée, a successful architect in Seattle, had discovered significant money missing from their joint accounts just months before their planned wedding. The second, a dentist in Vancouver, had found that Marcus had been using her professional credentials to secure business loans without her knowledge. "He has a pattern," Dad explained, his voice carrying the clinical detachment that made him so effective in court. "He targets successful professional women. gains their trust through apparent admiration for their achievements, then systematically positions himself to benefit from their success while undermining their independence. But the most damaging revelation was still to come. Marcus wasn't just an opportunistic gold digger, he was part of a sophisticated operation. His brother Jake, whom I'd always considered a harmless real estate agent, was actually running a network of men who specialized in targeting and exploiting successful women. They shared strategies, legal tactics, and even client lists, operating like a criminal enterprise disguised as a series of unfortunate relationships. As I absorbed this information, I felt the last vestiges of emotional attachment to Marcus dissolve completely. The man I'd loved, the partnership I'd believed in, the marriage I'd grieved, none of it had ever been real. I'd been a mark from the very beginning, selected and manipulated by someone who'd made a career of exploiting women like me, but Marcus had made one critical miscalculation in selecting me as his target. He'd chosen someone whose family didn't just have money and connections. We had a tradition of destroying people who threatened our own. And I was about to remind him why the Chen family had never lost a legal battle that mattered. The war Marcus had started by serving me divorce papers in a hospital bed was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The discharge from Riverside General came exactly 1 week after my father's arrival, but by then, I wasn't the same woman who'd been wheeled into that hospital nearly a month earlier. Dr. Martinez signed my release papers with a smile, commenting on my remarkable recovery and resilience. What he didn't know was that while my body had been healing, my mind had been conducting the most comprehensive strategic campaign of my life. My father had transformed my sterile hospital room into a war room. The small table beside my bed was covered with legal documents, financial records, and surveillance reports that painted a picture of Marcus's activities so damning that even Dad's experienced legal mind seemed shocked by the scope of the deception. Lisa Park had joined us for 3 separate strategy sessions, each one revealing new layers of Marcus's systematic fraud that we could use to destroy him completely. The beauty of our preparation was its invisibility. To any outside observer, I was simply a woman recovering from surgery with supportive family members helping me through a difficult time. Marcus had no idea that every phone call he made, every financial transaction he completed, and every move he made in his preparation for Thompson's Strategic Solutions was being documented by a team of private investigators my father had quietly deployed. Jennifer, my assistant, had become an invaluable intelligence asset without even realizing it. When she'd come to visit me in the hospital, I'd asked her to handle what seemed like routine business maintenance, updating security protocols, backing up client files, and reviewing our financial systems for any irregularities. What she'd actually done was create a comprehensive audit trail of Marcus's unauthorized access to Meridian Strategies' proprietary information, complete with timestamps and digital fingerprints that would be admissible in court. The most crucial element of our preparation involved Patricia, my godmother, and federal judge. Dad had briefed her on Marcus's activities during a carefully casual dinner in San Francisco, and while she couldn't directly intervene in our divorce proceedings, she could ensure that certain information reached the appropriate regulatory authorities. Marcus's pattern of targeting successful women wasn't just morally reprehensible. It potentially violated several federal laws regarding financial fraud and conspiracy. But the masterpiece of our strategic preparation was something Marcus would never see coming. We'd been building a comprehensive case not just for divorce, but for criminal prosecution. His systematic theft of my intellectual property, combined with the forged signatures on financial documents and the coordinated effort with his brother's network, constituted a federal crime that could result in serious prison time. Lisa had been methodically documenting every aspect of Marcus's financial deception, working with forensic accountants to trace the movement of our marital assets through his increasingly complex web of shell companies and hidden accounts. What we'd discovered was staggering. Marcus hadn't just stolen the $700,000 from our savings accounts, He'd been systematically looting our shared investments for over 2 years, hiding the money in accounts registered to fake businesses that existed only on paper. The Thompson Strategic Solutions venture was even more damaging to his legal position than I'd initially realized. Marcus had been using my client list to pre-sell consulting services, taking deposits from companies for work that would be performed using methodologies he'd stolen from Meridian Strategies. He'd essentially been running a con game, selling my expertise to finance his divorce and new life, planning to deliver substandard work once he'd already collected payment and disappeared. 3 days before my discharge, we received the most devastating piece of intelligence yet. One of Dad's private investigators had been monitoring Marcus's communications and discovered that he'd been coordinating with Connor Walsh, his divorce attorney, to time certain financial moves with my medical recovery. They'd been planning to freeze my business accounts immediately after serving the divorce papers, hoping to create a cash flow crisis that would force me into a quick, unfavorable settlement. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also legally catastrophic for Marcus. Attorney-client privilege doesn't protect communications that involve planning criminal activity, and using my hospitalization as a tactical advantage in financial manipulation potentially violated several laws designed to protect vulnerable individuals during medical crises. Lisa had been carefully monitoring Connor Walsh's activities as well, and what she'd discovered would make him seriously reconsider his representation of Marcus. Walsh had apparently been advising multiple clients on similar strategies, timing divorces to coincide with spouses' vulnerabilities, manipulating medical situations for legal advantage, and coordinating financial attacks designed to exploit temporarily diminished capacity. It was a pattern that could cost him his license to practice law. The most satisfying aspect of our preparation was how completely Marcus had underestimated the resources at my disposal. He'd seen a successful consultant with a growing business, but he'd failed to recognize that I was part of a family that had been wielding legal and financial power for generations. The Chen family didn't just have money. We had connections, influence, and a reputation for absolute ruthlessness when defending our own. My grandfather had built the family's legal foundation during the 1960s, when anti-Asian discrimination was still legal and socially acceptable. He'd fought his way into Stanford Law School, then into San Francisco's most prestigious firms, accumulating power and connections that 3 generations of Chens had carefully maintained and expanded. Dad had inherited not just wealth, but a network of judges, prosecutors, investigators, and business leaders who owed favors to our family. Marcus thought he was divorcing Isabella Chen, entrepreneur. He was actually attacking the Chen family legacy. And that was a mistake that would cost him everything he'd worked for and several things he'd stolen. The final element of our preparation involved something Marcus couldn't have anticipated. We'd been quietly reaching out to his previous victims. Lisa's investigation had identified not just his 2 former fiancées, but 3 other women who'd suffered financial losses after brief relationships with Marcus. None of them had pursued legal action at the time, but all of them were eager to provide testimony about his patterns of manipulation and theft. Sarah Morrison, the Seattle architect, had lost $180,000 that Marcus had transferred from their joint accounts to investments that turned out to be fictional. Dr. Emma Walsh, the Vancouver dentist, had discovered that Marcus had used her credit and professional standing to secure over $300,000 in fraudulent business loans. Each woman's story followed the same blueprint: initial charm and apparent admiration, gradual financial entanglement, systematic theft disguised as investment strategy, then sudden abandonment. But the most damaging witness would be someone Marcus had never expected us to find: his own brother Jake's ex-wife, Michelle Thompson. She'd been married to Jake for 4 years before discovering the brothers' coordinated scheme to exploit successful women. Michelle had evidence of their operation going back nearly a decade, including detailed records of targets, strategies, and financial outcomes. As I prepared to leave Riverside General, I felt a calm satisfaction that Marcus would never understand. He'd spent months planning his attack on me, timing it for what he thought would be my moment of maximum vulnerability. What he couldn't have known was that attacking me during a medical crisis hadn't made me weak. It had given me time to think, plan, and coordinate a response that would destroy not just his divorce strategy, but his entire life. The woman walking out of that hospital was nothing like the trusting wife who'd been brought in for emergency surgery. Isabella Chen was about to remind Marcus Thompson why you should never declare war on someone whose family has been winning legal battles since before you were born. Marcus had served me divorce papers thinking he held all the advantages. Tomorrow he was going to discover that he'd actually handed me every weapon I needed to completely annihilate him. The first sign that Marcus's carefully constructed plan was beginning to unravel came 3 days after my discharge from the hospital. I was staying at my father's guest house in the West Hills, a secluded property that offered both privacy and security while I continued my recovery. The location also provided the perfect base of operations for what Dad had started calling Operation Reckoning, our coordinated response to Marcus's betrayal. That Wednesday morning, Marcus called my phone for the first time since serving the divorce papers. I let it ring 4 times before answering, using a technique Lisa had taught me about controlling the psychological dynamics of difficult conversations. Isabella. His voice carried that familiar tone of concerned authority he'd perfected during our marriage. I heard you were discharged. How are you feeling? I'm recovering, I replied, keeping my voice neutral and slightly weak. Thank you for asking. Listen, I know the timing of the divorce papers was unfortunate. Connor advised me that quick action was necessary for legal reasons, but I want you to know this doesn't have to be adversarial. We can work together to make this as smooth as possible for both of us. There it was. Marcus's attempt to circumvent legal representation and manipulate me into making agreements without proper counsel. That sounds reasonable, I said, injecting just enough uncertainty into my voice to suggest I was still emotionally vulnerable. Let me see how I'm feeling by the weekend. After ending the call, I immediately phoned Lisa with a report. He's getting nervous, she confirmed. Our preliminary responses to his divorce filing have been deliberately minimal, which is making him wonder what we're planning. The longer we maintain strategic silence, the more mistakes he'll make. That assessment proved prescient almost immediately. Over the next week, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic as he tried to gauge my response to his betrayal. He began making moves that demonstrated growing desperation and poor judgment, exactly what we'd hoped to provoke. First, he attempted to accelerate the divorce timeline by filing motions for expedited asset division, claiming that prolonged proceedings would be detrimental to both parties' financial stability. The motion revealed his urgent need to access marital assets before I could mount a comprehensive legal challenge, but it also created an official record of his attempt to exploit my recent medical crisis for legal advantage. More damaging was his decision to begin operating Thompson's strategic solutions while our divorce was still pending. Marcus started advertising his new consulting firm using methodologies that were clearly derived from Meridian Strategy's proprietary approaches. He even used modified versions of presentation templates I'd developed, apparently believing that slight cosmetic changes would provide legal protection against intellectual property theft claims. The most catastrophic error came when Marcus decided to approach several of my existing clients directly, offering to continue their strategic consulting relationships through his new firm at reduced rates. He positioned this outreach as a humanitarian gesture, suggesting that my recent health problems might affect my ability to serve them effectively going forward. What Marcus didn't know was that 3 of those clients, Portland Tech Dynamics, Cascade Marketing Group, and Northwest Innovation Labs, had been carefully briefed about the situation by Jennifer, who'd reached out under the pretext of ensuring continuity during my recovery. When Marcus made his solicitation attempts, these clients immediately reported the conversations to us, providing recorded evidence of his attempts to steal my business using confidential information he'd obtained during our marriage. But the most devastating intelligence came from an unexpected source: Connor Walsh's own law firm. Lisa had discovered that one of Walsh's junior associates, Rebecca Martinez, was actually a former Stanford classmate who'd stayed in touch with our alumni network. Rebecca had been assigned to research precedents for Marcus's case, and what she'd found had made her deeply uncomfortable with her firm's representation. During a carefully orchestrated coincidental encounter at a legal conference in downtown Portland, Rebecca confided to Lisa that Walsh's strategy relied heavily on exploiting my medical situation and positioning Marcus as the stable, supportive spouse who'd been carrying an increasing burden as my health declined. The firm had been preparing character witnesses who would testify about my supposed emotional instability and declining business judgment. More damning was Rebecca's revelation that Walsh had been coordinating with other attorneys who represented Marcus's brother Jake and several members of their network. They'd been sharing strategies and legal precedents across multiple cases, essentially running a coordinated attack on successful women using similar tactics and timing. This coordination provided exactly the evidence we needed to transform individual divorce proceedings into a federal conspiracy case. Lisa immediately contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, providing preliminary evidence of an organized scheme to defraud professional women through systematic relationship manipulation and financial theft. Meanwhile, my father had been working his own network of contacts to apply pressure from multiple directions. Judge Patricia Yamamoto had quietly mentioned Marcus's case to several colleagues who specialized in fraud prosecution, ensuring that his activities were on the radar of appropriate authorities. Dad's connections in the business community had also begun asking pointed questions about Thompson's Strategic Solutions funding sources and client acquisition methods. The psychological pressure on Marcus was becoming visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Jennifer reported that he'd been calling Meridian Strategies repeatedly, claiming he needed to retrieve personal items from our shared office space. When she politely explained that all personal belongings had been inventoried and would be returned through legal channels, Marcus had become agitated and demanding, threatening to come get them himself if necessary. His social media presence, which had always been carefully curated to project success and confidence, began showing signs of strain. Marcus posted increasingly defensive messages about new beginnings and toxic relationships, apparently trying to control the narrative before our divorce became public knowledge. But his attempts at reputation management were clumsy and transparent, making him appear bitter and vindictive rather than sympathetic. The most satisfying development came when Marcus's real estate firm, Cascade Realty Group, began receiving anonymous tips about his financial irregularities and potential legal problems. The firm's management started asking uncomfortable questions about his recent transactions and client relationships, particularly given their strict policies about employee conduct and legal compliance. By the end of that week, Marcus was trapped in a rapidly tightening web of legal, professional, and social pressure, but he still didn't understand the scope of what was happening to him. He thought he was dealing with a slow-moving divorce case and some unfortunate business complications. He had no idea that every aspect of his life was being systematically dismantled by a coordinated campaign that had been planned with military precision. The positioning phase was nearly complete. Marcus had been isolated, his resources were being restricted, his reputation was under quiet attack, and his legal vulnerabilities had been thoroughly mapped. He'd spent months preparing to destroy me at my weakest moment. But all he'd actually accomplished was giving us time to prepare a response that would leave him with nothing. Soon, Marcus Thompson would discover that declaring war on the Chen family was the most expensive mistake anyone could make. The perfect moment arrived on a gray Thursday morning in November, delivered through an encrypted email that made Lisa's usually composed demeanor crack into the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. The subject line was simple: gift from Vancouver, but the contents would prove to be Marcus's complete undoing. Dr. Emma Walsh, the Vancouver dentist who'd been one of Marcus's previous victims, had done something extraordinary. Instead of simply providing testimony about her experiences with Marcus, she'd conducted her own investigation into his activities, working with a private detective to monitor his communications and financial transactions over the past 6 months. What she'd discovered was a real-time record of Marcus's planning for my destruction, documented in such detail that it read like a criminal confession. "This is beyond anything we could have hoped for," Lisa said as we reviewed the materials in my father's study. Emma's investigator managed to intercept communications between Marcus and his brother Jake that prove premeditation, conspiracy, and a pattern of targeting that spans nearly a decade. The intercepted communications revealed conversations that would have been devastating enough on their own, but became explosive when combined with the financial evidence we'd already compiled. In one particularly damning exchange from 2 weeks before my hospitalization, Marcus had written to Jake, "Isabella's been pushing herself too hard lately. When she inevitably burns out or has a health crisis, I'll be ready to move. The business valuation should be at its peak, and she'll be too compromised to mount effective resistance." But the most devastating evidence came from Marcus's own phone, which Emma's investigator had managed to clone during a business trip to Vancouver where Marcus had been establishing shell companies for laundering stolen assets. The phone contained detailed notes about his strategy for timing the divorce, manipulating my medical crisis, and coordinating with Connor Walsh to present me as an unstable business owner whose success was largely dependent on his guidance and support. Even more damaging were the photographs Marcus had taken of confidential Meridian Strategies documents, which he'd been systematically copying and sending to potential clients for Thompson Strategic Solutions. The timestamps proved that he'd been conducting corporate espionage for over 18 months, building his competing business using my intellectual property while still married to me and having access to my systems. The phone also contained evidence that Marcus's pattern of targeting successful women wasn't opportunistic. It was systematic and coordinated. He'd been part of a network that shared information about potential targets, including detailed profiles of professional women with substantial assets and businesses that could be exploited. The group had developed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques and legal strategies, specifically designed to exploit trust and vulnerability in intimate relationships. Lisa had already contacted federal prosecutors with preliminary evidence, but Emma's intelligence provided the final pieces needed to pursue criminal charges that could result in decades of prison time. "This isn't just divorce fraud anymore," Lisa explained as we prepared for what would become the most important meeting of the entire proceedings. "This is organized crime with a specific pattern of targeting women in professional positions." The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the federal building in downtown Portland, but Marcus didn't know he was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. Connor Walsh had requested the session as a settlement conference, apparently believing that prolonged litigation would be expensive and emotionally damaging for both parties. He'd positioned it as an opportunity for reasonable people to reach reasonable agreements without the adversarial nature of court proceedings. What Connor didn't know was that federal agents would be monitoring the meeting, and that everything Marcus said would be recorded and potentially used in criminal prosecution. More importantly, Connor had no idea that his own communications with Marcus had been compromised, and that several of his strategic recommendations potentially made him an accessory to federal crimes. I arrived at the federal building 30 minutes early, accompanied by Lisa and my father, who'd flown up from San Francisco specifically for this confrontation. We were joined by Agent Sarah Torres from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, who'd been investigating similar networks of relationship fraud targeting professional women across the Pacific Northwest. The conference room was deliberately intimidating. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and a large table that made every conversation feel like an interrogation. When Marcus and Connor arrived at precisely 2 p.m., I could see immediately that Marcus was unprepared for the scope of what he was about to face. He'd dressed carefully in his most expensive suit, projecting confidence and success, but his eyes betrayed the anxiety that had been building as his plan encountered unexpected resistance. "Isabella," Marcus said with his practiced, charming smile. "You look much better. I'm glad to see you've recovered so well. The calculated sympathy in his voice might have moved me 6 weeks earlier, but now it simply provided more evidence of his manipulative nature. Thank you, Marcus. I've had excellent support during my recovery. Connor Walsh opened his briefcase and removed what appeared to be a comprehensive settlement proposal. We're here in the spirit of cooperation, he began, to reach agreements that serve everyone's best interests without the expense and emotional toll of protracted litigation. Lisa allowed him to present his opening statement, during which Connor outlined Marcus's generous offer to resolve all marital issues quickly and amicably. The proposal included my keeping Meridian Strategies in exchange for Marcus receiving the house, significant cash settlement, and ongoing consulting agreements that would essentially pay him for methodologies he'd helped me develop. When Connor finished, Lisa smiled with predatory satisfaction. That's an interesting proposal, Mr. Walsh. Before we respond, I'd like to present some materials that might affect your client's negotiating position. She opened her own briefcase and removed a thick folder containing Emma's intelligence, federal, investigation documents, and evidence of Marcus's criminal activities spanning multiple jurisdictions. We have documented evidence of systematic financial fraud, intellectual property theft, organized conspiracy to exploit professional women, and potential violations of federal racketeering statutes. The color drained from Connor's face as Lisa methodically presented evidence of communications between Marcus and his criminal network, financial records showing systematic theft and money laundering, and proof of corporate espionage that had been conducted using his access to my business systems. Marcus's practiced composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "You can't prove any intentional wrongdoing. Everything I did was within my legal rights as a husband and business advisor." "Actually," Agent Torres said, speaking for the first time, "we can prove quite a lot. Mr. Thompson, you're being informed that you're under federal investigation for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. While you're not under arrest at this moment, I would strongly advise you to exercise your right to remain silent." The meeting that Marcus had expected to be his final victory in a calculated campaign became the moment his entire world collapsed. Connor Walsh immediately suspended his representation, citing potential conflicts of interest and ethical concerns. Marcus found himself facing not just an expensive divorce, but federal criminal charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison. But the most satisfying moment came when I finally spoke directly to the man who'd tried to destroy me at my most vulnerable moment. "Marcus, you made one critical error in your planning. You assumed that Isabella Chen was just a successful consultant with a growing business. You never bothered to learn that I'm also the daughter of one of California's most powerful attorneys and the goddaughter of a federal judge. You thought you were exploiting a vulnerable woman. You were actually attacking a family that has been destroying people like you for 3 generations. As Marcus was escorted from the building by federal agents, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding those divorce papers in my hospital bed. Complete, absolute victory. The man who'd calculated that my illness was the perfect time to steal everything I'd worked for was about to discover that targeting the wrong person can cost you everything you have and everything you'll ever hope to have. The perfect moment hadn't been something I'd created. It had been the inevitable result of Marcus's own arrogance and systematic underestimation of who he was really dealing with. The aftermath of that federal building meeting unfolded with the swift brutality that only comes when years of careful planning suddenly collapse under the weight of documented evidence. Within 72 hours of Marcus walking out in federal custody, his entire carefully constructed life began disintegrating in ways that exceeded even my most optimistic projections for justice. The first domino fell Monday morning when Cascade Realty Group held an emergency board meeting to address what their PR department was already calling the Thompson situation. Marcus had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of federal investigations, but the firm's Internal audit had uncovered financial irregularities that went far beyond his personal legal troubles. He'd been using company resources to fund his network of relationship fraud, including using Cascade's research databases to identify and profile potential targets. Jennifer called me that afternoon with an update that made my recovery weakened. Laughter echo through my father's study. "Marcus tried to access the Meridian Strategies building this morning," she reported with barely contained satisfaction. "Security turned him away, obviously, but he actually demanded to speak with you. Directly? When they told him you were unavailable, he started shouting about his rights as a business partner and threatened to sue for unlawful exclusion from jointly owned property. The delusion was breathtaking. Even facing federal charges for systematic fraud and theft, Marcus apparently still believed he could intimidate his way back into controlling my business. His desperation suggested that losing access to Meridian Strategies' resources and client base was more devastating to his financial position than I'd initially realized. But the most satisfying collapse came from an unexpected direction: his own criminal network. Jake Thompson, Marcus's brother and co-conspirator, had been arrested in Seattle on similar federal charges related to his own pattern of targeting professional women. Under pressure from federal prosecutors, Jake had decided to cooperate fully with the investigation, providing detailed testimony about their coordinated operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. Lisa shared the highlights of Jake's confession during our Wednesday strategy meeting, and the scope of their criminal enterprise was staggering. The Thompson brothers had been running their scheme for nearly 12 years, targeting successful women across the Pacific Northwest with surgical precision. They'd developed detailed profiles for identifying ideal victims, sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques for gaining trust and financial access, and coordinated legal strategies for maximizing their theft while minimizing criminal exposure. Their network included at least 8 other men operating similar schemes, along with corrupt attorneys, private investigators, and financial advisors, who helped launder stolen assets and create false documentation. The total estimated theft across all victims exceeded $15 million, making it one of the largest organized relationship fraud cases in federal law enforcement history. Marcus's individual role in the conspiracy was particularly damning. He hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd been serving as the network's strategic consultant, helping other members refine their manipulation techniques and avoid legal detection. His business background and apparent legitimacy had made him valuable for training newer members and vetting potential targets who worked in complex professional environments. The federal prosecutors were treating Marcus as a key organizer rather than just a participant, which carried significantly harsher penalties. Agent Torres explained that his leadership role in the conspiracy, combined with the systematic nature of his crimes against me, could result in sentences exceeding 25 years in federal prison. Connor Walsh's professional destruction was equally swift and comprehensive. The Oregon State Bar had launched an immediate investigation into his representation of Marcus, focusing particularly on his advice about timing the divorce to exploit my medical crisis. Several of his other clients had come forward with complaints about similar tactics, suggesting a pattern of unethical representation that extended far beyond Marcus's case. More devastatingly, Connor's firm had discovered that he'd been sharing confidential client information with the Thompson network, helping them identify potential targets among his own female clients who were facing divorce proceedings. He'd essentially been operating as a recruitment source for the criminal enterprise, while collecting legal fees from the very women he was helping to victimize. The Oregon Bar Association's disciplinary board had already suspended Connor's license pending the outcome of criminal investigations. His partnership at Walsh and Associates had been terminated, and the firm was facing potential closure due to liability concerns and reputational damage. But perhaps the most poetic justice came from the financial consequences that were cascading through Marcus's carefully constructed empire. The federal asset forfeiture proceedings had frozen not just his bank accounts, but all property and investments connected to his criminal activities. This included the Lake Tahoe property he'd purchased with stolen marital assets, the shell companies he'd created to launder money, and even his beloved Porsche that he'd bought using funds diverted from our joint accounts. The Thompson Strategic Solutions venture, which Marcus had planned as his post-divorce career, had collapsed before it even officially launched. Several potential clients had withdrawn their deposits upon learning about the federal charges, and the business methodology he'd stolen from Meridian Strategies was now evidence in criminal proceedings that made it legally unusable. Most satisfying was the reversal of financial positions that the asset forfeiture had created. While my business and personal accounts remained intact and growing, Marcus was facing complete financial ruin. His legal defense costs alone would exceed anything he could afford, even if he somehow avoided conviction and regained access to legitimate assets. The social consequences were equally devastating. Portland's professional community, which Marcus had spent years cultivating for networking and business development, had completely ostracized him once news of the federal charges became public. His former colleagues at Cascade Realty were distancing themselves professionally and socially, and several business contacts had preemptively terminated relationships to avoid association with his criminal activities. Sarah Morrison, the Seattle architect who'd been one of Marcus's earlier victims, had contacted me through Lisa to express her satisfaction with the federal investigation's scope. "I never thought I'd see justice for what he did to me," she'd said during our conference call. "Knowing that his entire network is being dismantled makes losing that money almost worth it." Dr. Emma Walsh had taken even more direct action, filing a civil lawsuit against both Thompson brothers for damages that included not just her financial losses, but emotional distress and professional reputation harm caused by Marcus's manipulation of her dental practice credentials. Her case was being handled by a prominent Vancouver firm that specialized in relationship fraud, and early indications suggested she would recover substantially more than her original losses. The federal prosecutors had offered me the opportunity to provide victim impact testimony during Marcus's eventual sentencing, but I declined. The satisfaction of watching his systematic destruction was more than sufficient justice for his betrayal. I preferred to focus my energy on rebuilding and growth rather than prolonging my connection to his criminal activities. As I reviewed the latest updates on Marcus's legal situation from the comfort of my father's study, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with validation. The man who'd calculated that my hospital bed was the perfect place to serve divorce papers had learned that some miscalculations carry consequences that extend far beyond what anyone could anticipate. Marcus Thompson had thought he was exploiting a vulnerable woman during a medical crisis. Instead, he'd attacked someone whose family had been systematically destroying threats for generations, and he was discovering that some battles can't be won through manipulation, timing, or calculated cruelty. The reckoning was complete, and it was more thorough than even I had dared to hope. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I stood in the renovated offices of Meridian Strategies, watching the Pacific Northwest rain streak down floor-to-ceiling windows that hadn't existed in our previous space. The expansion had been both practical necessity and symbolic transformation. Our client base had tripled since news of the federal investigation became public, with companies specifically seeking out a consulting firm that had demonstrated such comprehensive strategic thinking under extreme personal pressure. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's betrayal had inadvertently created the most effective marketing campaign in Meridian's history. Business leaders across the region had watched how I'd handled a calculated attack on both my personal life and professional assets, and they wanted that level of strategic resilience applied to their own challenges. We'd had to hire 12 additional consultants and move to a larger facility in the Pearl District to accommodate demand. Jennifer had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, a role she'd earned through her crucial intelligence gathering during the crisis and her exceptional management of operations while I recovered. During our Monday morning strategy meeting, She presented quarterly numbers that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. "We're on track to exceed $8 million in revenue this year," she reported with satisfaction. The federal case study has become required reading at 3 business schools, and we're getting consulting requests from companies who specifically want to learn crisis management strategies. Harvard Business Review wants to publish your methodology for managing coordinated attacks on personal and professional fronts. The transformation extended far beyond business metrics. I'd discovered capabilities within myself that years of successful consulting had never revealed. The ability to maintain strategic clarity while under severe emotional and physical stress, the skill to coordinate complex responses across multiple domains simultaneously, and perhaps most importantly, the wisdom to distinguish between emotional reaction and strategic necessity. Dr. Martinez had cleared me for full activity months earlier, but the person who'd emerged from that medical crisis bore little resemblance to the woman who'd collapsed in her office the previous year. The experience had burned away illusions about trust, partnership, and vulnerability that had made me an easier target for manipulation. What remained was someone who understood power dynamics with crystalline clarity and would never again mistake emotional attachment for strategic alliance. The house in Hawthorne had been completely renovated as well, transformed from the showpiece Marcus had designed to impress business contacts into a genuine home that reflected my actual preferences rather than his calculated image management. The formal dining room where he'd entertained potential clients became a library filled with legal texts and strategic planning resources. The sterile modern kitchen was replaced with a warm, functional space where I actually enjoyed cooking for friends and family. Most significantly, I'd established the Isabella Chen Foundation for Professional Women's Safety, funded initially with the substantial civil damages we'd recovered from Marcus's seized assets. The foundation provided legal support, private investigation services, and emergency financial assistance to professional women facing systematic exploitation through intimate relationships. Lisa Park had joined the foundation's board, bringing her expertise in relationship fraud cases to help us identify and assist victims who might not otherwise recognize the sophisticated nature of the manipulation they were experiencing. In just 6 months, we'd helped 43 women across the Pacific Northwest escape or prosecute similar schemes, and our research had identified patterns that law enforcement agencies were using to detect organized relationship fraud networks. The foundation's work had attracted attention from federal law enforcement, academic researchers, and advocacy organizations studying the intersection of domestic abuse and white-collar crime. Agent Torres had become a regular consultant, helping us understand how criminal networks adapted their tactics and sharing intelligence about emerging threats targeting professional women. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was personal rather than professional. I'd reconnected with aspects of myself that 7 years with Marcus had gradually eroded. The fierce independence that had driven me to leave McKinsey and start my own firm. The intellectual curiosity that had made me excellent at strategic problem-solving. And the quiet confidence that came from knowing I could handle whatever challenges emerged. The relationships in my life had been completely recalibrated as well. Friends who'd remained loyal during the crisis had deepened their connections with me, while others who'd shown concerning sympathy for Marcus's difficult situation had naturally drifted away. I discovered that surviving a coordinated attack on your life creates a remarkably effective filter for identifying authentic relationships versus those based on convenience or social positioning. My father had returned to San Francisco, but our relationship had evolved into something closer to professional colleagues than traditional parent-child dynamics. The crisis had revealed that we shared strategic thinking abilities and a ruthless commitment to protecting family that neither of us had fully recognized before. He'd started consulting me on complex litigation strategies, and I'd begun handling some business development for his firm's Portland clients. Patricia, my godmother, had become more than a family connection. She was now a mentor who helped me understand how to wield influence responsibly in legal and business contexts. Her guidance had been crucial in establishing the Foundation's policies and ensuring that our assistance to victims operated within appropriate legal frameworks. The dating landscape remained largely unexplored territory, not from fear or emotional damage, but from a complete recalibration of what I valued in potential partners. Having experienced systematic manipulation designed to exploit trust and emotional attachment, I'd developed screening criteria that made casual dating seem pointless, and serious relationships require levels of transparency that most people weren't prepared to provide. "You've become intimidating," Jennifer observed during one of our conversations about work-life balance. "Not in a bad way, but in a way that makes people understand they need to bring their best selves to any interaction. With you." She was right. The woman who'd survived Marcus's calculated betrayal had no patience for games, manipulation, or relationships that weren't based on genuine mutual benefit. I'd learned to value my independence too highly to compromise it for anything less than extraordinary partnership. The most unexpected development had been my emergence as a sought-after speaker on crisis management and strategic resilience. Universities, professional organizations, and corporate leadership conferences wanted to hear how someone had transformed a devastating personal attack into comprehensive victory through systematic strategic thinking. These speaking engagements had revealed that my experience, while extreme in its coordination and cruelty, represented patterns that many successful women faced in less obvious forms. The combination of personal manipulation and professional undermining that Marcus had employed was apparently common enough that audiences immediately recognized the dynamics I described. As I prepared for my first international speaking engagement, a conference in London focused on women's leadership in crisis situations, I reflected on how completely my life had been rebuilt. The woman who'd received divorce papers in a hospital bed had been vulnerable, trusting, and focused on rebuilding what had been damaged. The woman boarding a plane to share strategic insights with global leaders was powerful, clear-eyed, and focused on building something entirely new. Marcus had intended to destroy me at my weakest moment. Instead, he'd inadvertently revealed capabilities I hadn't known I possessed and forced me to reconstruct my life from a position of absolute strength rather than comfortable compromise. The transformation was complete, and it was more comprehensive than anything I could have planned or imagined. 2 years after Marcus delivered those divorce papers to my hospital bed, I found myself standing before 300 women at the Global Leadership Summit in Singapore, holding a small object that had traveled with me to every speaking engagement since my recovery. It was the hospital bracelet from Riverside General, a thin piece of plastic that had once symbolized my most vulnerable moment, but now represented something far more powerful. "This bracelet," I said, raising it so the audience could see, marked the moment when someone I trusted completely decided that my medical crisis was the perfect opportunity to destroy everything I'd built. What the person who made that calculation didn't understand was that they weren't attacking a vulnerable woman in a hospital bed. They were inadvertently awakening someone who had forgotten how strong she actually was. The response from the audience was immediate and visceral. I could see women throughout the auditorium nodding with recognition, some wiping away tears, others sitting forward with the intense focus that comes from hearing your own experience reflected in someone else's story. Over the past 18 months of speaking at conferences like this, I'd learned that the specific details of betrayal might vary, but the underlying patterns of exploitation and the possibility of transformation were universal. The question and answer session that followed revealed the true scope of why these stories mattered. A venture capitalist from Munich described how her business partner had tried to force her out during her pregnancy, timing legal maneuvers to coincide with what he assumed would be her distracted state. A surgeon from Toronto had discovered that her husband had been systematically undermining her medical practice while appearing supportive, creating professional problems that would justify his claims that she was too unstable to manage her career. Each story followed similar patterns. trusted individuals exploiting moments of perceived vulnerability, systematic undermining disguised as support, and calculated attacks timed for maximum psychological and financial impact. But more importantly, each woman had found ways to transform their crisis into unprecedented strength and clarity. The most dangerous assumption predators make, I told the audience, is that professional success makes women soft targets rather than formidable opponents. They see our achievements and mistake them for vulnerabilities instead of evidence of our capabilities. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation, despite sharing a surname, who headed a research institute studying economic crimes against women. Her data provided context that made individual experiences like mine part of a much larger societal pattern. Relationship exploitation targeting successful women has increased 47% over the past decade, she explained over dinner. The sophistication of these schemes has evolved as well. We're seeing organized networks that share intelligence and tactics, just like what you experienced with the Thompson brothers. Her research had identified what she called success exploitation syndrome, a pattern where women's professional achievements became the very characteristics that made them targets for systematic financial and emotional abuse. The perpetrators specifically sought out successful women because their assets made the potential payoff higher, while their busy professional lives created opportunities for financial manipulation to go undetected. But Dr. Chen's most significant finding was about recovery and transformation. Women who experience these coordinated attacks and successfully defend themselves demonstrate measurable increases in strategic thinking ability, emotional resilience, and leadership effectiveness, she reported. It's as if the crisis burns away self-doubt and reveals capabilities that success alone doesn't develop. This research validation of my own transformation was both gratifying and sobering. The experience that had felt so personal and unique was actually part of patterns affecting thousands of women worldwide. But it also meant that my response, the systematic legal and strategic campaign that had destroyed Marcus, could serve as a template for others facing similar attacks. The Isabella Chen Foundation had evolved far beyond my initial vision of providing legal support to individual victims. We were now conducting research, training law enforcement agencies, and developing early warning systems that could help women recognize exploitation patterns before significant damage occurred. Our network had expanded internationally, with partner organizations in 12 countries sharing intelligence about criminal networks and successful defense strategies. Lisa Park had become the foundation's legal director, splitting her time between direct victim assistance and developing new legal frameworks for prosecuting relationship exploitation as organized crime. Her work had contributed to legislative changes in 3 states that enhanced penalties for systematic relationship fraud and made it easier for victims to recover assets that had been hidden through complex financial schemes. The personal transformation had been equally profound, though more subtle than the professional achievements. I'd learned to trust my instincts with precision that bordered on supernatural. That same intuitive intelligence that had built Meridian. Strategies could now detect manipulation and deception with remarkable accuracy. Relationships in my life operated under completely different dynamics, based on mutual respect and transparent communication, rather than the emotional dependency that had made me vulnerable to Marcus's exploitation. Dating remained challenging. Not because of emotional damage, but because of elevated standards that most people couldn't meet. I required levels of honesty, accountability, and emotional maturity that eliminated 90% of potential partners before serious consideration. The few relationships that had developed were with people who found my strength attractive. Rather than intimidating, individuals secure enough in themselves to appreciate partnership with someone who wouldn't tolerate manipulation or compromise her independence for artificial harmony. Marcus himself had become irrelevant to my daily existence, except as an instructive example in my speaking engagements. He'd been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to racketeering charges, and would likely serve at least 12 years before parole consideration. His criminal network had been completely dismantled, with convictions resulting in over 200 years of combined prison time for the various participants. But more satisfying than his imprisonment was his complete erasure from relevance in my life. The man who'd once seemed central to my identity and future had been reduced to a cautionary tale I shared with audiences to illustrate how predators reveal themselves through their timing and tactics. Standing on that hotel balcony in Singapore, looking out at a city that represented global business leadership and innovation, I reflected on the journey from that hospital bed to this moment. The woman who'd received divorce papers while fighting for her life had been trusting, accommodating, and focused on maintaining relationships even when they were harmful. The woman addressing international leadership conferences was strategic, self-possessed, and committed to building systems that protected others from similar exploitation. Marcus had calculated that my medical crisis was the perfect moment to strike, because he assumed vulnerability equaled weakness. What he'd actually done was provide me with the clarity that comes from seeing someone's true character without illusion, and the motivation that comes from understanding exactly what you're capable of when everything you've built is under attack. Chator's hospital bracelet in my jewelry box wasn't a reminder of trauma. It was evidence of transformation. Sometimes the people who try to destroy us at our weakest moments give us the greatest gift possible: the opportunity to discover just how strong we actually are when we stop accepting less than we deserve. That lesson, born from betrayal but refined through victory, was worth sharing with every woman who still believed that being successful meant being vulnerable, instead of recognizing it as proof of being formidable. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.